just a brief note on Soviet and Russian views on the United States. In the Glasnost Perestroika period and in the Yeltsin years, the United States, I think, was mostly viewed very favorably by the Soviets and then the Russians. It was seen as a place of great prosperity, and it was, for the most part. It had significant levels of freedom, again, high levels of social mobility. The problem is that Russians tended to view the America that they saw as associated with this guy on the right, Ronald Reagan, and his policies. The problem is that they were actually viewing an America that was the creation of this guy on the left, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The America that we see today is now the creation of the gentleman on the right and his policies. So they were looking at the wrong guy in terms of the model and the policies to emulate. And they got it wrong. So thus you had figures like Anders Ostlund and other ambulance chasers who arrived on the scene promoting shock therapy policies. And so people were thinking about what did they want? Well, did they want something like communism? Well, the answer at the time seemed to be no. Did they want McDonald's and freedom? I guess they thought for a while maybe yes. And then seeing the outcomes or the results, maybe thought that maybe this wasn't the best thing to have. And so we find ourselves now in an environment in which people are seeking alternatives again, alternatives for a post-global world. But before we address that, just a few brief comments on how the United States solved the problem of this high issue of costs and what it did to solve the problem in addition to, tapping Chinese labor, which was cheap. One could drive wages down to restore corporate profits, which the United States did. But then, how do you maintain demand in the economy? Well, what the United States did, and what some European governments eventually did, and what the Japanese would eventually do as well, would be to make recourse to debt and credit. That's how you would square this circle. That's how you would deal with the issue of increasing productivity, the ability of the economy to produce more goods, and how you're going to actually consume those goods in an economy which is marked by stagnating, if not lowering wages. So the United States first does this with some fairly significant budget deficits, especially during Ronald Reagan's time in office. And then it's going to resort to private credit. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. It would also financialize its economy, as I said. What this chart shows is the dramatic rise in the financialization of the American economy as represented by corporate profits. And so what you can see here is that roughly around 1970 or so, the end of the Bretton Woods order, finance represented about 15% of corporate profits. Now, we need some financial intermediation in the economy. You can't completely do without banks. But by 2002, this figure rose to 42%. Now, you'd be hard challenged to present a coherent argument for explaining how the financial sector is delivering value commensurate with taking nearly half of all U.S. corporate profits. It can't be done. So finance went from actually serving economic growth to actually becoming a tax on it, from becoming an enabler of, a lubricant for economic growth, to becoming something like a medieval feudal lord that imposes taxes and returns nothing of value in exchange. Labor discipline would be restored. Here you can see, just in brief, the dramatic reduction in the number of labor strikes that we saw in the United States and European countries in the post-Bretton Woods order and in the beginning of the 1980s. So I think we all know how governments did that. In the United States, it began with Ronald Reagan and the PATCO issue. But getting back to this very central issue of demand and debt, the United States' creation of very, very large public debts, in other words, government deficit spending, or military Keynesianism, which is what Reagan used to power the economy, added at some point made the bond markets nervous, and it began to make debt expensive to service, and thus the government had to move to begin to rein it in. This happened under the presidency of Clinton. But this didn't mean that debt went away. It was now just shifted over to the private sector. People were given credit cards. Even students were mailed these things. When I was a student, a graduate student doing my doctoral work, I must have been receiving 4 new credit cards a day in the mail. People were begging me to take their money. Well, people did. People took the money. They built up massive debts. This powered the economy, but it then created a big debt overhang, which people could no longer sustain. The other mechanism by which demand continued in the economy was through asset inflation. So again, if wages are down, how to have productivity gains reflected in the economy in ways which you continue to consume? Well, housing inflation was one of the chief ways of doing it, and inflation in the stock market. Well, ultimately, they reach these dizzying heights. Investors get nervous, they bolt, and we see a crash. So we see this alternating cycle of public and private debt in the era of low wages, which is what we see in the period of globalization. And the only response that governments have following the 2008 crisis, since they are convinced that they can no longer deploy debt as an instrument for generating demand over the long term, is to impose austerity. So we come back full circle to the problem of mature capitalism that we saw in the 1920s and the 1930s, that the horrors of World War and economic collapse finally gave policymakers religion on in terms of countering these trends of mature capitalism, and we return to those very trends. So money was diverted into, again, instead of investments in new innovations which could have transformed the economy, again, wealth was generated by factor accumulation. This is economists' fancy term for putting more hands to work for longer hours. The spatial fix, David Harvey's term for including more areas in the zones of exchange and trade, the post-Soviet bloc being the chief example. And austerity is now the fix, and we see the results in places like Spain, the United Kingdom, Greece. It's very, very unpleasant. We see our infrastructure eroding, so our very investments in maintaining our modern societies are actually eroding, they're atrophying, and we're not doing the things that we need to maintain the modern economies and the middle classes which we built in the last century.